Hello, folks. I'm going to take you through this week's lecture once this loads. Um, so, of course, we're not meeting this week, but in lieu of that, I thought maybe I'd walk you through this a little bit. Most of you had some exposure to evolutionary theory at some point in your education, so you're going to have some basic understanding of it. And really, that's all I want you to have understand as far as the biological theory of evolution, and particularly with regard to microevolutionary stuff like genetic drift and alleles and all that kind of stuff that really is very important to for biology. It's very important to us as studying historical geology as well. But really, it's the macroevolutionary change, which of course is facilitated by microevolutionary change. But the macro is what we see in the fossil record, and that's where paleontology as a subfield of the geosciences really has a lot to add when it comes to the history of life and the history of this planet. So let's get going. All right. The first thing is the dispel some misconceptions. I have another presentation linked for you that does dispel misconceptions. And here's a video. I'm not going to play it for you right now, but it's in the PowerPoint. So go ahead and open it up and take a look at it. The biggest misconception is this idea that we evolved from apes. Of course, we didn't evolve from apes. We are cousins with them. We all evolved from a common ancestor, but we did not come from chimpanzees. So put that out of your mind right away. Okay, moving on. Evolution simply says that organisms descend with modification from their ancestors. And really, evolutionary change is mainly focused on the offspring, not so much on the parents. The parents are genetically, unless they're exposed to radiation, that alters their DNA, but largely they are who they are. It really just comes down to when reproduction occurs, is there variation that's created through the mutation of genes, and does that variation get passed down? If it gets passed down, when it's manifested itself as a phenotype, does it actually make that organism more or less fit for the next environment? And sometimes, most of the time, mutations don't do anything. They don't really affect the fitness of an organism to live in its environment. But sometimes those mutations can have an effect. So paleontology is really the study of the history of life as revealed by fossils. And of course, we can't actually look at microevolutionary change through the fossil record, at least not at this point. But we can say something about macroevolutionary change, and how species have changed over time, and lend support to the biological theory of evolution through that. Of course, the tree of life is quite complex, and this is impossible to see on this screen, but if you play the presentation, you can zoom in and take a look. But really, it's looking at all of life. There's a lot of different variations of this online these days. There's some interactive versions that are great. And we'll come back to it because there's a couple of them. There's like treeoflife.com, or if you Google Tree of Life, you'll find some interactive versions that are really fun to play with. But the point is, you look at an image like this and you're like, wow. So of course, life begins all the way down here at the bottom, the main category. And then of course, we've got the 5 kingdoms and so forth, and somewhat the whole kingdom, found, class, order, family, genus, species. The Linnaean classification system is a bit not passe, but it's, it is what it is. It's a limited model for how to classify things, but we classify organisms based on a variety of things. Of course, historically, it's been on physical features or phenotypic variation. But more and more, we're classifying organisms or reclassifying them based on their actual DNA, because we can actually sequence their DNA. So that's quite useful. Sometimes the physical characteristics don't necessarily speak to us the same way that the genetic characteristics do. Okay, so of course the tree of life, we break up the base of it by breaking things up into 5 kingdoms. And of course, this is looking at the bacteria, protists, fungi, animals, and archaea, as well as plants. So this is including not just the eukaryota, but the prokaryota. But regardless, once you get past this point, things get really crazy, really diverse really quickly. But if you go all the way back to the Precambrian, over 600 million years ago, there was not anywhere near the variation there is today. And in fact, even though today we talk about there being a great deal of genetic variation, when you go back even just to 300 million years ago, there's a great deal of genetic variation. And the important thing to remember here too is that the fossil record only preserves about maybe 2% of all the life that's ever existed. Because you have to have a pretty special situation to be able to get preserved. Get buried quickly, have hard parts, and then of course your buried parts have to be able to survive for a very long time. So, despite the variation that exists, you may not be a fossil one day, nor may anything around you be a fossil one day. So to become a fossil is pretty special. All right, and of course, humans are not immune from this. Naturally, there are of course those who have certain religious persuasions who would argue with me on this. But as a Christian myself, I have no issues with any of this. So it is what it is. But evolution also affects our species, and has led to the development of our species. And you can see near the top where Homo sapiens they're listed concurrently with both Homo erectus and Homo sapien neanderthalensis. And we even interbred with Homo sapien neanderthalensis. In fact, when you do your DNA, if you do use like 23andMe, I have 272 variants that are shared with Neanderthals, which is an excellent piece of evidence to talk about, interbreeding. We were different subspecies, but not different species. So if you're from Europe, your ancestry is from Europe, you likely have Neanderthal DNA. If your ancestry is from Africa directly or from Asia, it's possible you don't. All of us have East African DNA, even just a little bit, because all of us, the original humans, came out of East Africa. So there's a lot of really, really important things here. But the thing is to look down to this column. On the left-hand side, you've got millions of years ago, and on the right, a little bit of archaeological information in terms of technology changes, stone tool technology changes on the right-hand side. But you'll note that Homo sapiens have not been around that long, much less than a million years, more like 50 to 100,000 years. And so if you go back in time, you have to go, you can see where these common ancestors are. Moving on here, this is mainly the genus Homo. And of course, how do we know? Well, we have changes in skull shape, skull volume, skull features over time, from supraorbital ridges above the eyes to occipital ridges across the skull. And then, of course, the position of the foramen magnum, which tells you something about whether they walked upright or not. The protracted or not so protracted nature of the jawbone, the dentition, the gaps between dentition. There's all kinds of things we look at. So, and if you compare our skulls to a chimpanzee, you can see one of our earliest ancestors, the Australopithecus afarensis, is very similar to a chimpanzee. So you can tell how that ancestor was quite close to the common ancestor between the two, but chimpanzees didn't live back then either. So they have not been around for 4 million years. And this is just looking at cranial capacity through the genus Homo, from the Australopithecines really through their descendants, the Homo, genus Homo, and you can see how cranial capacity has increased, especially in the last 2 million years. And that's sometimes attributed to the advent of meat eating, which is likely true, and development of the ability to develop stone tools and other tools that would help you procure food. Okay, so originally, evolution's actually been around for a long time. I mean, you talk about people like Aristotle, who did notice the differences between organisms and was able to note that there were changes enough that something must have happened. But over time, as the theory developed, the first really big name you hear with it is Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, which, you talk about Lamarckian evolution, where, a giraffe's neck gets longer because it's reaching for the trees, as opposed to, genetic variation, actually a mutation of genes allowing the neck to be longer in subsequent generations, and natural selection selecting for those giraffes with subsequently longer necks because of their ability to reach those tall trees. The trees didn't grow in response to the giraffes, although maybe they did. Maybe the trees may have gotten taller along with the giraffes as a result of being selected for. The short trees get eaten up, and so they go away. Likewise, the giraffes that can't reach the trees as the environment changes also go away. Anyway, so characteristics are not acquired. Characteristics are inherited. He did get that right. but he also didn't have a mechanism for it. He had a little bit backwards and didn't have a mechanism for how that occurred. Then eventually Darwin and Wallace, who ironically came up with the idea of natural selection at the same time, working in very different parts of the world. They both realized that organisms possessed heritable variations, and some variations are more desirable than others. Natural selection was the missing element of evolutionary theory. And once they came up with that and published it, which for Darwin came out in The Origin of Species, he resisted publishing it for a good 20 years. He knew it was going to be a bombshell. And, especially for people who were very religious, it was going to be a big bombshell. And it was already controversial, evolution at the time. Incidentally, Charles Darwin Sr., actually his grandfather, was a poet, I'm getting this right, and actually wrote about change. So even this whole idea of evolution was in Darwin's lineage on some level, going back quite far. So this is the time in Victorian England when people tended to be pretty religious, but of course it's also post-industrial revolution, so it's also a time of new ideas and new frontiers. Very scary for a lot of folks, and just as it is today. Anyway, 1859 is really kind of the mark of when evolutionary theory, as we know it today, kind of became its modern thing. So favorable variations in genetics are more likely to survive and reproduce, and reproductive success is based on whether you're the fittest for the environment or not. It's pretty straightforward. But again, not all variation makes you fit. We could talk about different kinds of artificial selection as well, where humans have gotten involved and taken something like the wild mustard and turned it into a variety of nice brassica vegetables that we all know and love, or in some cases abhor. I know my son doesn't like broccoli or any of these, but one of my sons anyway. This is all done, of course, through genes and chromosomes, which were not known at this time, but in 1859. But these came along later, or knowledge of these came along later. So understanding how cells divide, understanding how genes and genetic material is transferred from parent to following subsequent generations became later, but really lended support to evolutionary theory in great measure. And so, of course, learning how cells divide through meiosis and mitosis is important. And of course, what brings back when the cells divide, the genetic materials pass on. So mutations bring about variation, or variation is brought about by mutations, and they can be harmful, beneficial, or neutral, as I said before. But we don't know, of course, whether or not it's going to be one or the other. It depends on the environment the offspring are born into. There are different kinds of speciation that produce viable offspring. Allopatric, phyletic, and then punctuated equilibrium. And this is one of my favorites. Stephen Jay Gould popularized this idea, which was that species stay very stable for a period of stasis, a very long period of time, until such time as the environment changes significantly, or that some of the new mutations that have occurred or whatnot actually do come into play, and suddenly, not necessarily suddenly, but geologically suddenly, you end up with new species being developed. Again, the process of speciation is still a little bit mysterious, but we're still, it's still not as well understood as we'd like it to be, but we know it happens. So I'm going to move on here. You can look at the bird stuff here in the, really what this is getting at though, is when you have divides in environment, you fragment environments, whether by putting waterways in between them, like islands in the ocean, or otherwise you end up, or mountains for that matter, you end up with two populations from one, and those two populations can then evolve in different directions, and as genes mutate in different ways, leading to different speciation that way. As far as back to humans are concerned, we can track the Y chromosome, which is of course passed on by the from men who come from different areas, but so we have this idea of this mitochondrial Eve as well, where we all come from the same mother in East Africa. And that's what's kind of going on here. And that's been well documented at this point. But as humans moved out of Africa and out of those savanna environments, that of course led to natural selection as mutations in genes made our subsequent species more or less fit. One of the things about humans, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, interbreeding that's kind of important is, at least what's been discussed at some point, is, if you have a Neanderthal, which is a very robust form of Homo sapien, breeding with the sapien sapien, which is the more gracile version, us, perhaps it may have been difficult for mothers of the Homo sapien sapien variety to give birth to their offspring if they were mated with a Homo sapien neanderthalensis, because the babies may have been much more robust and may have had difficulty passing through the birth canal, leading to both death and mother and child. And that might have been quite common. Obviously, some were successful. Otherwise, we wouldn't have variants passed on down to us. But the Neanderthals did eventually go extinct, and why they went extinct is a subject of a lot of research right now. And that's just one idea of many that have been thrown out as hypotheses. Okay, so there's of course divergent evolution, where ancestral species give rise to descendant species, and they go their own ways. And then convergent evolution, which is actually where different places on the tree of life sort of come together and develop similar things like wings. Birds developing wings, and then of course insects developing wings that happen at different times. That might be a really rough example, but it's an example. And then parallel evolution, where you develop similar characteristics in closely related organisms. Okay, so I'm going to kind of go through some of this a little bit more quickly. We're going to breeze through this bit here. This is showing you some of those parallel evolutionary things, or things that have occurred that we still share with our chimpanzee cousins, that we inherited and maybe have developed the same way in the different lines of descendant. Okay, so in modern times, we make a distinction between macroevolution and microevolution. So microevolution are the changes that occur within a species, and then macroevolution encompasses all the changes above the species level, which is really speciation plus everything else. And macroevolution is believed to be simply the outcome of microevolutionary change over time. And again, in the fossil record, it's very difficult to see. You can't see microevolutionary change except through what we know has happened through macroevolutionary change. Okay, so where you have this early organism, you can see its descendants change over time to become eventually a form of rhinoceros that existed during the Cenozoic era. Then, of course, there's still the same lineage of organisms, but genetic variation over time and natural selection have led to descendants that still bear a lot of the same characteristics, but contain others as well, much like our human ancestors. In paleontology, in order to do this, we use cladistics, which is what you're going to use in your lab this week. You're going to do it with fasteners, which is fascinating. I hope you find it fascinating anyway. Where you create a cladogram. And cladograms are really based on taking a suite of organisms and organizing them in a way that you recognize the common ancestor, but then also recognize descendant variation that occurs and then creates descendants that are different. So it's basically a branching tree of sorts it's a branch, and then has little branches off of it. When we have to distinguish characteristics from convergent evolution. So here's an example, especially in the bottom right, example B here. But basically, cladistics are looking at time. A cladogram is looking at time on the y-axis, looking at A, and then change in form on the x-axis. So when you start at the bottom of a cladogram, you're starting earlier in time. When you end at the top of the cladogram, you're later in time. So it's organized just like a rock column would be. And as you move from the left to the right, you're looking at changes in forms. And here in the cladogram, you can see wherever there's a line crisscrossing the cladogram itself, you see a description of what's been developed. So macroevolutionarily. So for instance, to go from a basic vertebrate, which a shark is, you add a bony internal skeleton because sharks are cartilaginous, and you end up with lungfish as the primitive form of bony fish. Once you add, distinguish between lungs and gills, and placoderms, of course, being an example of not having lungs but breathing through gills. Then you add 4 limbs with 5 fingers and toes, and you end up with salamanders. Then an amniotic egg, and you end up with dinosaurs. And then you end up with either two openings behind the eye for dinosaurs and birds, or feathers for birds. Now that feathers one, That's an interesting one because now we think some dinosaurs may have had feathers. So we may have to we would reevaluate that once we start finding more evidence. And again, the fossil record is kind of picky. But that's how you go along with this, okay? As you go up through time, variation occurs, and that's the beauty of a cladogram. It helps us organize what we're seeing in the fossil record. Create a model of it, basically. Of course, there are also sometimes extinctions. Now, there's something called background extinction, meaning organisms go extinct all the time, and it's a relatively low rate of extinction. But during mass extinctions, you get an accelerated rate of extinction, like is occurring right now, for instance. It's often argued that we're in a sixth mass extinction. But there have been 5 big ones. And when extinctions occur, niches open up, or space, ecological space for new organisms open up to be evolved into, or to be not evolved into, but moved into by organisms that are fit for those ecological niches. And so that's important to consider as we think about the big 5 extinction events: the Ordovician, the Devonian, the Permian, the Triassic, and the Cretaceous, and of course today's extinction event. So evidence supporting evolutionary theory. Again, evolutionary theory is a theory, but what that means in science is nothing small. It means that it allows you to explain the evidence you see from a wide variety of sources, and then also make predictions that can be tested. And of course, congruent with Karl Popper's argument that all science must be falsifiable and testable, evolutionary theory must make testable predictions, and indeed it does. So, we get our classifications system from Linnaeus, but we use evolutionary theory as our model for making predictions as an explanatory model, but also making predictions that allow us to test things. We've already kind of been through cladograms here. That all goes back to Linnaeus. I kind of got little things out of order here. Here we're looking at. Did I skip a slide? Oh, evidence. Yes. So we're looking at. This is another way of organizing a cladogram here. All right. So homologous structures that different species have that look similar. Your arm structure is a really great example of this, often used, where you have your upper arm is one single bone, your lower arm is 2 bones, and then your fingers have many, many bones. That's an example of a homologous structure because we share that with pretty much anything going back to reptiles. So there's a reptile arm, upper arm, lower arm, and hand. And likewise, you can see that in all these organisms, which descended from reptiles, the common ancestor with reptiles, we have the same structure for the arm. And of course, other evidence, biogeography. So the geographic distributions of organisms as we see it allows us to describe, the fact that speciation has definitely occurred on remote islands. The Galapagos are a commonly described place where you have all of Darwin's finches, which is where he first noticed that variation that led to the theory of evolution. So the longer an island has been separated from the mainland, the more its biota will differ. You could argue humans are the same thing. If you isolate a population of humans on an island for, say, 100,000 years, they're going to be different. We can learn from fossils a number of things. We have body fossils, which are remains of shells and bones. We have trace fossils, which is, or ichnofossils, which is an indication of organic activity, such as burrows, footprints, things of that nature. And then we know that the fossil record shows a sequence. For instance, you don't find human bones with dinosaur bones because they didn't live together. They never lived together, contrary to what some people might tell you. Humans have evolved within the last million years. Dinosaurs all went extinct 65 million years ago, the exception of birds, of course, which are descended from theropod dinosaurs. But that's a whole nother story for another time. So, all right. So some 8 million years ago, there was a forest ape that was a common ancestor. And of course, we do not share, we don't share that same lineage with gorillas or even chimpanzees. You can see where they branch off, where the genus Homo branches off, for the Australopiths and so forth. All right, transitional fossils. One of the big critiques of evolution sometimes is there aren't enough transitional fossils in the fossil record. And of course, this isn't true. There are lots of transitional fossils in the fossil record. A good example is horses. And there's one of the labs you're going to work on this week deals with horses in the fossil record. So, so we'll look at that as well. So in summary, it's well supported by evidence, just like any other major theory would be. Continues to confirm, the evidence keeps coming in, continues to affirm evolution as a mechanism, as a series of mechanisms that produce new species and that explain how life appears. We may disagree as scientists on the rates, on the significance of one fossil or another, or the details of various lineages, but we all agree as scientists that evolutionary theory is the groundwork for the modern theory of all of modern biology, and a significant chunk of the geosciences. And of course, that's assuming you don't include biology in the geosciences, which I would argue would be a good way to include it, would be a good thing to do. But regardless, it's a very important foundational theory for all the earth sciences and all the biological sciences. Okay, with that, I'm going to call this to an end. If you have any questions, let me know. But do check out the other resources. I think you'll find a lot of them very useful. So until